All right, welcome everybody to this webinar today on deep dive on risk analysis under the German Supply Chain Act. I see that the numbers of attendance is growing, so I would give it another minute or so for everybody to dial in, so that we give everybody the chance to listen to this from the beginning. But of course, we don't want to punish the people that are on time, so I will just wait 1 minute. And yeah, thanks for your patience until then. Okay, let's get started. I see we have only 66 people so far. We have quite a few registrations, so we have more than almost 300 registrations. But for the sake of time, I propose that we just get going. So first of all, thank you everyone for that is here already for showing up for this third webinar in our series on the German Supply Chain Act and on specific requirements under the German Supply Chain Act and tools that we and the German PST that we're co-hosting this series with can offer to you. Also, of course, this is a public webinar, so it's also for stakeholders to engage with us to better understand what tools we offer to the companies that we work with. And in that sense, yeah, also welcome to all the non-amfori members. This webinar today will focus really on a deep dive on risk analysis under the German Supply Chain Act. As I said, it's the third in a series. We held the first one on the reporting obligations under the German Supply Chain Act in December, the recording of which you can also find on our website. Then we had a second one last month that focused really on the supply chain knock-on effects of the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. So on all the companies that are do not fall directly under the scope, but indirectly. And this one, of course, also is speaking about the German Supply Chain Act's obligations on risk analysis. But of course, this is something that any upcoming due diligence legislation, such as the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, will also require you to do. So it's also relevant for companies that are not located in Germany. So in that sense, we're holding this webinar in English or the whole series, since the obligations on due diligence are the same to a large extent, and of course also largely aligned with international standards such as the OECD due diligence guidelines, which the amfori BSCI revision also has recently strongly aligned with. So we also made sure that our system aligns with these standards to be able to provide you with the tools that you need to really meet these obligations. Now, before going into the who amfori is, just also a couple of housekeeping rules. I mean, you are all muted. You can, of course, leave or you're encouraged to leave your questions or comments in the Q&A box or chat box, whatever you find easier. We'll monitor both. We'll also share the recording of this webinar and the slides afterwards. And then there will be a brief satisfaction survey at the end. Now, before really going into or handing over to Michaela, let me also give you a brief update on or brief overview of the agenda. So we will start with Michaela, who will give you really an overview of how to conduct a systematic risk analysis along value chains. So really speaking about the requirements also under the law. Then we will have a long Q&A. From the previous webinars, we've seen that there's always been a lot of questions and a lot of interest. So we will maintain this. And then afterwards, we will have Erika Sock from amfori, as well as Anina Buse, advisor at the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, to really provide a bit of an overview as to what we offer as organizations in terms of tools and resources to support you with risk analysis. And then we have another brief Q&A about that before I close. Now, considering that we have also quite a lot of non-amfori members participating today, I would just like to say a few words about amfori as well. So we're a large business association of more than 2,500 members, mostly brands, retailers, importers, and we really help them improve their ESG performance of their value chains through robust due diligence. Our members use our platform to map out their supply chain. We have more than 30,000 producers on the platform. That's producers in China, Bangladesh, India, Turkey, and Vietnam. So really the main sourcing countries of our members. And then, we support through different tools. That includes monitoring tools, audits, self-assessment questionnaires, and so on, in the different product lines. So on BSCI, on the social due diligence scheme, on BAPI, the environmental counterpart, and then these monitorings can be tracked on the platform. And then, of course, continuous improvement activities can be used, as well as, of course, capacity building, which supports the entire process. So we have hundreds of trainings for both members and producers on the different performance areas under BSCI and BAPI. And of course, all of this is aligned with international standards, with the UNGP, UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as the OECD due diligence guidelines, the ILO core conventions, and so on. And considering that our cradle is really advocacy and trade, we still have this as a strong pillar of our organization. So we really support our members indirectly by advocating for a trade and legislative framework that supports responsible business conduct. And then, of course, we also have a supply chain grievance mechanism, Speak for Change, which all our members can use. And that is what we will focus on in the next webinar on the 22nd of May. So much about amfori. I'll leave it at that. Erika will give you a deep dive into the risk analysis aspect later on. So I'll not talk about this. And now I hand over to Michaela on how to conduct a systematic risk analysis along value chains. Michaela, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Francis, and thanks to amfori and Partnership for Sustainable Textiles for inviting us again to present on the requirements of the German Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act. Before I start with that, few quick words about who we are as the Helpdesk. We're a government program supporting companies and business associations in implementing human rights and environmental due diligence processes. Our advice is free of charge and confidential. In addition to our advice services, we run training programs, including a free of charge e-learning program that might be of interest to you. However, our consultation services focus on German companies, but some of our other services are available to everyone, especially our online services. And I want to invite you to go online and check them out, because I believe that they are huge. They can be incredibly helpful in implementing due diligence processes. Just as a quick overview, our SME Compass, I think, is a great tool not only for small and medium-sized enterprises, but to companies of all sizes. And it consists of two components, a due diligence compass, which is an online guide that leads you step by step through the steps necessary to implement due diligence processes within the company. And the second component, our standards compass that we just launched last year, is a tool that shows how you can use standards and certifications in the due diligence process, shows what limitations could be as well and where to be careful, and includes a tool with which you can compare several standards. As of now, only 20, unfortunately, but we're working very strongly on expanding that to cover around about 300 available standards in relation to sustainability. Our CSR risk checker is an online tool for the abstract risk analysis that I'll be speaking on today as well. And our third tool, the business and human rights navigator, shows how to address 10 selected human rights issues within the context of the due diligence process, and accompanies that with practical guides, examples from practice, best practice examples from companies, how they resolve certain issues in real life. Yes, coming to the actual topic of today, the risk analysis. As a quick overview, you can see on the left-hand side the due diligence management system, the risk management system to which the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act obliges companies that fall within the scope to implement. Consists of strategy and implementation, risk analysis, preventive and remedial measures with which companies must react to identified risks and violations, a grievance mechanism, effectiveness assessment, and communication and reporting. In the center of this system, you see the due consideration of the interests of affected persons, and this is something very key about the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. Other legislative approaches or also non-binding approaches to business and human rights. What these laws all require is a change of perspective that we'll take a little bit of a closer look at a little bit later. And this due consideration of the interests of affected persons in the context of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act is not only relevant when designing and implementing the management system, but it's also relevant when designing and implementing the individual elements of this system, including the risk analysis, and especially in the context of risk analysis, considering the interests of affected person and also communicating with them and consulting them can be hugely beneficial in order to, for example, verify results from risk analysis. The risk analysis in the context of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act is a procedure to identify, assess, and prioritize risks. And when we're advising companies on how to do that, we recommend to them to go through this in several steps. And this is also something the BAFA advises companies to do, which stems from the reasoning of the legal proposal with which the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act was proposed by the government. So it's advisable to split up the risk analysis in an abstract and concrete risk analysis, as it's called. So the abstract risk analysis as a desktop research looking at what risks and violations might potentially be relevant in the context of a specific supplier, and then the concrete risk analysis as the step to filter out which of the risks and violations that could be relevant are actually relevant in the context of a specific supplier. Before doing that, it might be a good idea to take a step back even before the abstract risk analysis and try to gain an overview, because otherwise even conducting the abstract risk analysis might be very, very difficult. So it would be very helpful to gain an overview over your supply chains, over the different actors in the supply chains, especially the suppliers and the processes that are taking place at the suppliers levels, but also about their structures, about potentially affected persons at these suppliers levels, so especially employees or neighboring communities of these suppliers at the different stages. And you can do that by risk mapping, business areas, location, products, services, countries of origin. And then as a last step, so after gaining an overview, conducting abstract and concrete risk analysis, you will need to assess and prioritize the identified risks and violations according to the criteria of the appropriate manner. And the appropriate manner of acting in accordance with the due diligence obligations is something that we meet again and again in the context of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. The term alone is used about 20 times in the law and is the tool with which we define how much is expected of a company in relation to the management system as such, in relation to almost all of the elements, except only communication and reporting. and also in relation to risk analysis. And in the context of risk analysis, the appropriate manner is relevant twice, because it defines how much a company has to do in relation to the risk analysis, because it has to conduct an appropriate and effective risk analysis, but then it also plays a second role when it's about to assess and prioritize the identified risks and violations, to then use this as a basis for taking action in the context of preventive and remedial measures. And what this is, appropriate manner, I would like to show now. I know this is something. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. We have a lot of non-native speakers in the room, and there's a few comments here on whether we can slow down a little bit. I think we have enough time during Q&A, so I think we can take a little bit more time for the presentation. I know last time you overran a bit, and that's why maybe now you're trying to speed up a bit, but I think we're fine time-wise. So in that sense, we can slow down a little so people can follow. But yeah, thank you so much.
No problem at all. I'm sorry. I'm rather a fast speaker and sometimes need to be reminded to speak a bit slower. So as I said, the appropriate manner is relevant in the context of the management system, its individual elements, and in the context of risk analysis. It's important twice, because it defines because companies are obliged to conduct an appropriate and effective risk analysis and then use the criteria of the appropriate manner for assessment and prioritization to then decide upon which of the identified risks and violations they need to act. And the appropriate manner is a flexible standard. And with this, the German Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act reacts to the fact that companies, their supply chains, the risks they're dealing with, the resources that are available, the sphere of influence, and so on, are very, very different. And it would be inadequate to require the exact same steps of all the companies in relation to all of their suppliers. The criteria of the appropriate manner basically implement a risk-based approach instead of a watering can approach, and a demand of companies to specifically tailor the different measures, including risk analysis measures, to the situation of the individual suppliers. And this can mean that in relation to some suppliers, very in-depth and extensive risk analysis methods are needed, for example, site visits or conducting audits. But it can also mean that in relation to other suppliers, it is sufficient to send them a questionnaire. And it might also mean that in relation to some suppliers, depending on how many risk-prone suppliers a company has overall and how much resources are available, that some suppliers will not be asked at all or will not be asked all of the questions. Because if we look at the risks or if the protected legal positions under the German Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act, the human rights and environment related legal positions, not all of them play a relevant role in all of the contexts in which companies are operating. And what we're seeing at the moment, unfortunately, is a development that some of you might find a bit funny even. Many German companies are trying to implement, we call it the watering can approach, by sending supplier questionnaires to all of their first tier suppliers with questions relating to all of the legal positions in the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. And since the majority of German obliged companies, suppliers are other German companies, this leads to the situation that German companies extensively question other German companies as to whether child labor, the most severe forms of child labor, forced labor, and so on, are a problem at these suppliers' levels, which is in the German context, in most branches, a very unlikely scenario. So what the criteria of the appropriate manner tell companies to do is to take a closer look at where they have an influence, where where there is a severe, non-reversible or less reversible and very likely occurrence of a violation, and where they contributed to a violation. And we have to keep in mind that these criteria are not in a specific hierarchy to one another. And so this means it would be inadequate to use them as a set of strainers to filter out at whom companies should not take a look. So companies cannot first look at, of all the suppliers they have, who are the actors on which they have influence. Probably this excludes 80% of their suppliers already. Then they take another look at where do they expect the most severe, the least reversible, and the most likely a violation. Then maybe this leaves another 10% out, and they have only 10% of their suppliers left. And then they look at to which of the problems at these remaining suppliers did I contribute. And then they have maybe just a handful of suppliers they actually need to investigate. This is not what is intended under the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act. Instead, these criteria must be used to next to one another. They must be weighed against one another. And this can mean that a company must look at a supplier even though they have not contributed to the problem and they have just a low ability to influence them, just because the violation is expected with a high likeliness and with a high severity. Or it can also mean that they have contributed a lot to a situation, have very little possibility to influence, and maybe the violation related requirements are met just in a medium way, and they still need to take action. And what is so difficult about these criteria, but I think it's also where the chances lie with these criteria, companies have a margin of appreciation, so they can interpret them. They're not free in interpreting them, but there are some margins of interpretation for them. And as a result, when we look at who has to be investigated, with what tools, how in depth do we have to look, how far do we have to go when investigating risks and violations at a supplier's level, we find the answers not only by looking at this individual supplier, but also by looking at all my suppliers. Because if I have just a few suppliers, none of them are high risk, and have just one where the criteria are met intensively, then I have to focus most of my resources on this one. But if I have a huge portfolio with lots of medium and high risk suppliers, the answer to this might be a very different one. On the next slide, I want to talk about the second element with which the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act defines whether companies meet what is required of them, because companies have to act not only in an appropriate manner to fulfill their due diligence obligations, but also they have to act effectively. And here we have to, of course, keep in mind that the Act does not require companies to guarantee that their supply chains are free of risks and violations. They don't. The law does not prescribe obligations of guarantee, but instead of the obligations of means, so obligations to act towards a certain goal. And this, when we're looking at the risk analysis within own operations, of course, the situation is a bit different, because there the companies are the primary actor who are obliged to fulfill certain legal standards. And this means that we have actually an obligation to guarantee. But when we're looking into the supply chains, there's an obligation of means. And the effectiveness tells us which direction companies have to go, and the criteria of the appropriate manner then tell us how far do they have to go, because not always do they have to reach the goal, which is obviously no risks and violations. And effectiveness basically means that the actions that the companies are taking, or the actions from which they're making a selection, are such actions that are that make it possible to reach this goal. It doesn't mean that they have to reach the goal. This is the appropriate manner, but they must make it possible to reach the goal. And this also means, in the context of risk analysis, that not all methods that companies are using might be helpful to achieve this goal. So when we're looking at the practice, for example, of using self-assessment questionnaires, in some contexts, it might be not very likely that answers to these questionnaires are being made in a truthful way. And this might mean that this, as a risk analysis tool in relation to this particular supplier, not in relation to all suppliers, but in this particular situation, might alone not be effective. And in a context where, because of the background of the criteria of the appropriate manner, this of companies, it's necessary that they actually investigate the risks and violations there, because they are to be expected, for example. That means that they might have to add other methods of risk analysis in addition to the self-assessment questionnaire. This could be speaking to local communities, potentially affected persons, or their legitimate representations. This could mean that they conduct an audit, or they visit the site, but there's a lot of other possibilities that don't necessarily mean if a self-assessment questionnaire is not considered effective, the next step is an audit, which is the most costly risk analysis tool probably. So an appropriate selection and an appropriate fulfillment is only of a certain measure is only allowed among effective measures. And when conducting a risk analysis, it's also advisable to not only look at the risks and violations, but also look at what are the reasons for specific risks and violations. And I think it's advisable. I would like to stay on the last slide, please. I'm sorry. I think it is advisable to always closely analyze own procurement behavior, because in many cases, companies contribute to risks or violations by their own procurement practices, by their own contractual practices. When, for example, prices are too low to pay adequate wages and meet health and safety regulation, environmental regulation. But of course, it could also mean that too short deadlines, spontaneous changes in product specification or in deadlines might lead to overtime, for example, which, if not compensated, leads to violation of the right to adequate wages, with a whole other bag of problems that might be connected to this. And in this context, it's important to analyze this, because procurement practices should always be analyzed as a potentially contributing factor, because in the reasons for risks and violations often lies the answer on how to combat them effectively. So in many cases, this is a little bit some advice on the measures, but it kind of is closely connected to risk analysis, which is why I'm mentioning it here. In many cases, it might be not sufficient to, for example, react with a supplier code of conduct alone when one has contributed to risks and violations by own procurement practices or by own contractual practices. And I want to say a few things in relation to contractual practices just very briefly, because this is not really the topic here, but it is closely related. Because if the supplier code of conduct only transfers the responsibility for the due diligence to the supplier, and maybe is also connected with termination clauses that allow the customer to terminate the contractual relationship when there are problems, this might lead to suppliers not being very open in the context of, for example, filling in a self-assessment questionnaire, because they fear that they might lose their client, their customer, when they openly communicate about problems. So this is something that should be kept in mind in the context of risk analysis, a supplier code of conduct that does not include responsible exit clauses, but instead exit clauses that shift the responsibility and the burden just to the supplier's level might lead to there being problems in the context of the risk analysis. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about the change of perspective that the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act requires companies to do. This is very key. As I've mentioned, you've seen the little symbol that shows the management system with the due considerations of the interests of potentially affected persons at its center. And this is the main change that the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act requires companies to do is they need to shift away from the classic risk management perspective and outside-in perspective, looking at what are the risks that I'm facing as a company, for example, market liquidity or reputational risks, and turn towards what risks am I creating to what is around me, to my surroundings, the environment. So especially what are the effects that I am creating on the environment and on people, and especially particularly vulnerable people, and looking at taking a rights-based approach, so looking at what potential rights could be violated, such as child labor, payment of wages, workers' rights, etc. I'm going to say a few more words on the abstract and concrete risk analysis before then talking about how suppliers at different and affected obliged companies can work together in a more meaningful way to work together in the context of the risk analysis. So on the next slide, I'm going to speak about abstract and concrete risk analysis. So the abstract risk analysis as the first step after having kind of done a broad mapping of the different supply chains, the actors, the potential violations, potentially affected persons, and so on. With the abstract risk analysis, companies should use should take a more broad and general approach, and then it's basically a desktop research, take into consideration publicly available, especially publicly available information, and look at branch-specific and country-specific risks. There's several tools you could use for that. One good approach is, for example, to use indices on human rights, and there's various indices in relation to specific human rights, but also such that take a more general approach. And one other tool that you could use in this context is our tool CSR Risk Checker. It's a database that is based on around about 3,000 documents from media, from NGOs, from government organizations, from academia, to find out what potentially could be an issue in the context of your supplier. Of course, this doesn't give you any answers on whether these issues are actually a problem at your supplier's level. So maybe it is a country context in which adequate wages are generally a problem, but your supplier is already tackling this issue, has given all employees written contracts, is documenting the payment of wages, and is not only paying the legal minimum wage, but also paying a living wage, and can prove that. So this then would be something that you have to investigate in the next step in the context of the concrete risk analysis, where you will have to draw upon, for example, internal knowledge that might be available in different departments within your company, especially procurement. People working in procurement usually know the suppliers very well and know what could be problems. And then there's different other internal documents that you could use. For example, if there have been audits, you might be able to draw upon the audit reports to find out what the situation is on the ground. And then, of course, self-assessment questionnaires might be a helpful tool if you can expect them to be answered in a truthful way. And also in the context of audits, we all know that in the past, audits have not always been very helpful, especially when they were conducted in a context where corruption is a problem and there have not been sufficient measures been taken against corruption. But generally, audits are very, very good tool if you keep in mind, or if you take precaution against corruption, to make sure that you can actually find out what is happening on the ground. Yeah, we all know that in the context of risk analysis, as well as in context of other elements of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, we're also seeing some problematic practices from obliged German companies in relation to their suppliers. We've had a whole webinar on this topic, but I also want to mention it in the context of risk analysis, because I find it very important in this context as well. Because German obliged companies have to investigate risks not only within their own operations, but also in relation to their supply chains, in relation to their direct and indirect suppliers. They need to turn towards them in some way or another to find out, what are the risks in violation at these suppliers levels. And this creates many different problems, especially for direct suppliers of obliged companies, because they're in this unfortunate sandwich position, because they are the actors mediating the connection to the deeper supply chain, to the indirect suppliers, and are facing requests not only in relation to the situation at their own operations, but also in relation to the deeper supply chain. And oftentimes, they're not only being investigated by their obliged customer in relation to themselves and their suppliers, but they also are asked to guarantee, in the context of contractual assurances, code of conducts, for example, that they're not only addressing risks and violations at their own operations, but also within their supply chains. And in this context, we need to keep in mind obliged companies need to conduct an appropriate and effective risk analysis. Obliging their suppliers who have no obligations under the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act and are maybe not able to do this either, in most cases, is not a contribution, a meaningful contribution to an effective and appropriate risk analysis. So the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act does actually not intend a mere transfer of obligations, but instead due diligence and risk analysis should be understood as a shared responsibility, and against the background of effectiveness and appropriate manner, companies need to also look at how can the burden that is being created, especially the financial burden, be shared in a meaningful way, keeping in mind that the actors legally obliged to conduct due diligence are the obliged companies in Germany. And in many cases, we see that obliged companies request information that is not necessary. So what I have described, that German companies are sending questionnaires to other German companies with a lot of questions in relation to human rights and environmental problems, that in most branches in Germany are a very small exception. Oftentimes, they're also asking their suppliers to reveal information that they might not want to share, for example, sensitive information in relation to production processes, or information that makes the sub-suppliers identifiable. Some suppliers don't want to do that, especially if they are traders, because they fear they might be excluded from the supply chain. And when companies are facing such demands from their customers, in this context, I would advise them to be very careful and try to enter into dialogue with their clients in order to find out how they can help them with conducting the risk analysis, but also protecting their need to protect certain information. And obviously, there's no obligation at all to collaborate. However, market realities might force suppliers of obliged companies to collaborate, at least in some way, if they want to stay in business with these clients. Kind of depends on the market situation of the individual supplier. And then, of course, these contractual assurances, they are usually not a meaningful contribution to risk analysis. And we need to also look at what costs are created by self-declaration, self-assessment questionnaires or audits, and are these costs compensated, at least to some extent, by the obliged company. And here we need to keep in mind that these self-assessment questionnaires, especially when companies take the watering can approach, create an immense administrative burden on companies, because many suppliers don't only receive one questionnaire, but they might have many obliged customers that are all sending, in essence, this very similar or the same questionnaire, that are all so different that they need to be filled in again and again. And so this is something where I can only invite companies to maybe consider working together with other companies to, for example, create a standard or unified questionnaire, maybe in certain branch contexts, to reduce the administrative burden in this context. So this is, this was the deep dive into risk analysis, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Michaela. We have quite a few questions here in the chat. So starting off, there was a question around concrete examples of effective measures and ineffective measures. You did elaborate shortly after on your slides on some measures, but maybe you can reiterate a bit as to what you consider effective or what may be ineffective.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy to answer this question because whether or not a risk investigation method or risk analysis measure might be effective really depends on the specific context. And I don't want to generally exclude self-assessment questionnaires, on-site visits, or audits from measures, and I can't because they are good risk analysis measures, and they're definitely something that companies should be using. And I also wouldn't know what else to do. I mean, other than maybe add to these measures other verifying measures, for example, entering into dialogue with potentially affected persons, such as employees or neighboring communities of production sites, or their legitimate representations. What is not effective is if the risk analysis is merely transferred from the obliged company to their supplier, and the supplier has to guarantee that they are doing it now instead of them. So they're investigating risks not only at their own level, but also in the supply chains. But here also it's difficult to give a generalized answer, because it might also be that the obliged German company doesn't only transfer this task to the supplier, but that they're also, for example, compensating them for the costs that are created by that. And generally, this is permitted. So it is allowed to, for example, outsource this. And in this context, this, for example, would not be disqualified as ineffective or inappropriate per se. And also, it really depends on the specific situation. I've mentioned the context in which it is unlikely that a supplier truthfully answers self-assessment questionnaires, that then maybe other methods need to be added to the self-assessment questionnaire, or maybe audits should be used instead. But I think some answers can already be verified if one consults potentially affected persons or their representatives. Of course, this consultation then needs to happen in a way that gives them a safe space to actually truthfully answer the question, so maybe not in front of the employer. But it really depends on the context. And then of course there might be situations where a supplier of German company is another German company who has own obligations, and if they then say, I do this already, this is perfectly fine. Also, it might be that a supplier is a foreign company, but a large multinational enterprise who for one reason or another is also implementing due diligence processes. Of course, companies can rely on assurances from these companies to a different extent. And I think what has to be kept in mind is what incentives are created by other things that the companies are doing. For example, I've mentioned contractual clauses. So if contracts are designed, or code of conducts are designed in a way that deters suppliers from openly talking about problems, then maybe the self-assessment questionnaire will lead to answers that are like, everything is great, you don't need to worry, if they worry that they will be excluded from the supply chain if they truthfully answer.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michaela. It's very useful. So we can say mix of measures, including CSR indices in the context of abstract analysis, as well as audits, self-assessments, dialogue, also with affected stakeholders, and so on. Just from the next question, there is a question here on who will actually supervise. First of all, when companies in Germany, for example, you mentioned that there are companies starting to send out questionnaires to their first-tier suppliers, which are in many cases, also German companies themselves. Who will actually supervise whether the risk analysis is done correctly and effectively, and how will the decision be made, and what will be the penalty in case of non-compliance?
So for the penalty in case of non-compliance, I will need to take a quick look into the law, because I don't know this on the top of my head, but there is actually sanctions for not conducting risk analysis on time, or not conducting it at all, or not conducting it in the way that they're supposed to conduct them. The risk analysis, the obligation to conduct a risk analysis, as well as all other obligations under the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, are monitored by the Federal Bureau, the BAFA, and they're also the authority who, in relation to non-compliance, can force companies to comply, or can sanction them financially, or by excluding them from public procurement. And the BAFA receives a report annually from the obliged companies, and based on this report, they look at whether companies complied with the reporting obligations, but also in general with the obligations. But in addition to that, they also investigate companies on a random and risk-based approach. So this means that they first start looking at companies where they are expecting the biggest problems, basically, to look at whether they comply with their due diligence obligations. And when it comes to reporting, or also when it comes to this assessment of companies by the competent authority, companies need to make what they are doing plausible to the competent authority. And of course, it is possible that they are able to convince BAFA that these standard classic risk shifting contracts that are so common and have also been so very common before the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, or the practice of just using questionnaires and then these guarantees in a combination, are sufficient. But I believe that, I don't think that the BAFA will find this adequate. And we're at the moment finalizing a guidance that we're writing, the Helpdesk is writing together with BAFA. I hope it will be released soon, and then as soon as possible translated into different languages, because it is very relevant also to suppliers in relation to collaboration in the supply chain. And there we very clearly say that this is not how companies should approach risk analysis or the other elements of the due diligence system. So they shouldn't just try to transfer obligations.
Thanks, Michaela. Next question relates to which tiers have to be analyzed in terms of risks. So till which tier does a company have to carry out risk?
So you might all know that the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act divides the supply chain into 3 stages: own operations, direct suppliers, and indirect suppliers. And in relation to indirect suppliers, obligations under the law only exist when a certain knowledge threshold is reached, that is called in the law substantiated knowledge, and means that there's actual indications for potential violation at an indirect suppliers level. And when there is these actual indications, this means as a first step, companies have to conduct an ad hoc risk analysis. So the risk analysis has to be conducted annually, and there also are obligations of ad hoc risk analysis, for example, when there's substantiated knowledge, but also when there have been fundamental changes, such as a change in the country situation, or also a change in the supply chain because they're having a new supplier in a risk context, for example. And so this kind of, when we look at this substantiated knowledge and this differentiation between direct and indirect suppliers and the obligations, this gives many companies the impression that obligations primarily exist in own operations and towards direct suppliers. I think this is a misconception, because if we look at how easily substantiated knowledge is fulfilled, so this might be a supplier is in a risk country, in a high-risk country. It might be that there is part of a risk branch. It might be that there is NGO reports or government reports on the problem, or it might be that there have been problems at this supplier in the past. So this is sufficient for substantiated knowledge. So substantiated knowledge is fulfilled quite easily. And then if we look at the appropriate manner, it actually means we need to look at where the problems are. This kind of takes the focus away from the tier 1 suppliers, especially if there are other German companies.
Then there's a question whether there are any guided tools also for small companies to survive this challenge. I see that there was also a link posted to the MVO Risiko Checker. I guess the German Helpdesk risk checker itself is also one of those. But yeah, do you have other examples that you can share here?
Yeah, one great tool that could be used, I think, is our SME Compass. I've talked a little bit about it in the beginning. It has two components: the Standards Compass is the new component, and the Due Diligence Compass. And the Due Diligence Compass is a very hands-on practical guide that guides you through the process of implementing a risk management, a due diligence system within your company. And it is divided into 5 chapters that correspond to the 5 phases of the due diligence process, according to the UN guiding principles and also the German National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. So it's something predating the Due Diligence in Supply Chains Act. And you can not only use it to implement a whole management system in your company, you can just jump through the phases and do just parts of it. For example, you can just go to so you can have it's not like that independent, because some things build upon another and most things build on the risk analysis, but you can also do it just to use the risk analysis. And you'll find very many practical tools, for example, a risk assessment Excel sheet that you can use to assess and prioritize risks, the various tiers of your supply chain. That's something I can recommend in this context, and it's designed especially to meet the needs of SME, because they are working with a different set of resources compared to bigger companies.
Thanks, Michaela. Then there's a question on who will actually review the risk assessment result and decide afterwards on follow-up actions, including also audits or audit frequency basis on the risk level. And then the risk assessment will be done by the unified tool, or different element will be developed according to the industry situation.
So the risk analysis, as well as the measures and the whole management system, is something that is a task of the obliged company, and is something that is under the scrutiny of BAFA if they're deciding to investigate this company, or if they're analyzing their reporting. If companies cannot justify why they did not take action in a specific context, for example, this might lead to problems. But generally, it's up to the company to make this decision, and there are some margins for appreciation when interpreting the criteria of, especially of the appropriate manner. Yeah.
Then there was a question related to the sharing of costs. You mentioned earlier that it's important that there's fair cost sharing. Of course, that's fairly subjective, so I don't know if you have further guidance.
Yeah, cost and burden sharing, that's something that's mostly relevant in the context of remedial measures, because they're the most costly measures, but of course also plays a role when we're looking at risk analysis, because this doesn't come for free either, especially when it comes to audits. They're very costly, we all know, and also there's a huge burden created by these self-assessment questionnaires. And generally speaking, risk analysis is a task of the obliged company. If the obliged company turns toward their supplier in a way that doesn't promise success, in the meaning that it cannot be expected that the supplier can collaborate in this context in the risk analysis, because they don't have the means to do so. Maybe they cannot fill in all the self-assessment questionnaires that they have received, or they are not able to bear the costs for audits. This might already be an ineffective risk analysis measure if the costs should be divided this way. And this is something that we have to keep in mind in this context. And then the criteria of the appropriate manner can also mean that a lot more has to be borne by the obliged company. And generally, we have to keep in mind in this context the legal obligation to conduct risk analysis lies with the obliged company. This is something where cost burden sharing is a little bit different to cost burden sharing in the context of measures, because when we're looking at measures, not complying with health and safety regulation is a violation of the that needs to be addressed in the context of the German Diligence and Supply Chains Act by an obliged company, but is also something to which a supplier is primarily obliged according to domestic law. So there we have two actors who are obliged under different sets of laws to address this. The risk analysis, however, there only is a legal obligation, at least in the context where we have the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, the non-obliged supplier who doesn't have any due diligence obligations under other domestic laws, and there's very few countries who already have due diligence laws. So there's only one obliged actor, and so the cost should actually remain with the obliged company.
And I guess that that report or document that you mentioned earlier that will be published, I guess, next month or so, on also what are the obligations of companies under the law and the ones that do not fall under the law. So where you draw the line will also shed some light on this. And if I remember well, there's also the possibility of sanctions for companies that are merely outsourcing or passing on their own obligations to their direct suppliers. So that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah.
There's also a question here on audits. So if an audit has been conducted and there's a compliance audit through BSCI or SMETA or whatever, and the audit report can demonstrate that the factory's risk of social compliance is not given, does that mean that you're off the hook?
It kind of depends on the situation. I mean, audits play a tremendous role already, and their importance will grow because of the German Diligence and Supply Chains Act and other legal developments. In many cases, though, extreme problems with audits have come to light. I mean, we just had the 10-year anniversary of the Rana Plaza collapse, and we know that the factory building had been audited just a few months before its collapse, and the audit included building safety and also no child labor, for example, and among the deceased were children as well. So we need to keep in mind that in many contexts, the auditing industry is not working in a very responsible way, which might contribute to, instead of discovering problems being concealed. And so what is important in this context is that because of these problems, the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act does not implement a safe harbor approach. This means that by using third parties, companies do not free themselves of their legal obligations. And it's, of course, very difficult because in order to investigate the situation on the ground, expertise is needed that might not be available in the company. So they need to it's advisable to rely on third-party expertise, so technical expertise, country knowledge, language, and so on. You need lots of information and lots of skills that you might not have as a company, but you need to also take a close look at who's doing the audit and is there precaution against especially corruption, in order to make sure that the audit leads to not to results that you would like to see, like there are no problems, but actually to the result, what is happening on the ground.
And what's the frequency of risk assessment? Like, should it be carried out every year, once every 3 years, or whatever? Like, what's the frequency that is requested?
So the law obliges obliged companies to conduct an annual risk analysis, and then also they might have to conduct an ad hoc risk analysis when there's, for example, substantiated knowledge, or when there is a fundamental change, for example, new supplier or change in the country risk profile. And when we look at the annual repetition of the risk analysis, it means companies have to annually do an adequate and effective, appropriate and effective risk analysis. And I understand it this way, that it can mean that not all not each annual repetition of the risk analysis is the exact same steps that we did in the first risk analysis. So in my understanding, but we need to keep in mind that we're stepping onto new legal grounds with the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, and we don't yet have any administrative practice or jurisprudence that we could use as guidance. But I understand it in a way that by using the criteria of the appropriate manner, it can mean that I don't have to investigate all the actors that I've investigated last year, the next year, but it can also mean that based on the findings from my last year's risk analysis and the criteria of the appropriate manner and the goal of effectiveness, I look at some of them every year, and maybe some of them I only look at the next year, depending on the findings from the last risk analysis. But this is my personal understanding. We don't yet know how the BAFA understands this.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, 2 more questions, and then I'd like to move on to the other presentations, because now we're kind of running out of time. So there's one question on generally if there are any trends on practices that downstream companies are putting in place to map their supply chains and identify indirect suppliers. So thinking of traceability systems, geolocalization, or other. If you can have any insights here that you could share in terms of trends.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I know oftentimes blockchain is discussed in this context, but it kind of really depends on the on how I can connect blockchain to the actual trade in goods and services to make it to track it. There are lots of tools available that are not free of charge by private actors. There's many software solutions, system solution providers, but then we have to be quite careful as to whether they meet the promises with which they're advertising. I mean, I believe software can play a huge role in helping companies to conduct due diligence, but we need to be a little bit careful with some of the promises that are being made at the moment. And what is a bit of a challenge at the moment, I believe, with these systems is that they don't seem to be interoperable. So one company is using software A, another company is using software B or software C, and they're all, for example, sending questionnaires, trying to map the supply chain. But if one company has already filled in company A, B, and C's questionnaires, but the next client is using company D, this might be a bit of a problem. So this is also something maybe companies should use to put pressure on these software providers, because only if they're interoperable, they're kind of shifting or lifting some of the burden that the questionnaires are creating. And some of these tools can also be really good in trying to make a supply chain transparent without putting a supplier in this uncomfortable situation of having to actually reveal to their customer who the upstream suppliers of theirs are, because they can then use the information, put it into the software tool, for example, and then it's then stripped of the identifying elements, or it's maybe even verified by a third party and then in a different form given to the customer. This is a really good approach, but then we need to make sure that they're interoperable.
Yeah. All right, I have 3 more questions here. I will try to summarize it to an extent, so Michaela, that you can respond in one go, and then we'll move on to the other presentations. So any other question coming in specifically to Michaela's presentation now, we won't be able to answer at this point, unfortunately. Just one question from someone from Bangladesh. So great to see that we also reach companies in Bangladesh, organizations in Bangladesh, since of course the German Supply Chain Act, even though it works within its own jurisdiction, has strong implications on big sourcing countries such as Bangladesh. It's one of the biggest sourcing countries for amfori members, second biggest after China, and of course a huge exporter of particularly ready-made garments, textiles to Europe. So here the question is how it will work with across the border, and I guess indirectly I already gave some hints to this, but maybe you can speak to this very briefly. But then also a question on how to prevent corruption in auditing, but then also living wages, how to tackle this topic if the suppliers are not willing to share anything related to costing or the price breakdown of the product. So that's the 3 questions in a nutshell. If you can try to give a brief answer to this, I know it's a challenge, but if you can try to keep it short, and then we move on to Erica.
Well, it's 3 really difficult questions, and I'm not very good at keeping things short, unfortunately. So I'm going to give it my best try. I mean, the law, I mean, it's the German domestic law obliging companies situated in Germany of a certain size, but it does have effects across the globe, I hope, because these companies have to conduct due diligence in relation to not only their own operations, but also in relation to what's happening at their suppliers' level. So companies cannot, as they always did before, say that protecting human rights in another country and managing human rights impacts or environmental impacts that are related to their value generation by the means of their supply chains, that this is something that the domestic authorities in this other country should be taking care of. But instead, companies need to step up and take responsibility for what's happening in their supply chains, especially when we're talking about problems they are actively contributing to, for example, by their procurement and contractual practices. Corruption in the context of audits, I mean, this is a whole topic where we could probably spend a whole day in discussing, because it's a multifaceted problem that's also not the exact same in all of the country contexts, and I probably don't know all of it in all the different country contexts. There is a very good analysis by the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, where they analyzed audits that failed in the last 10-20 years. So they analyzed the audit in Rana Plaza, Bangladesh. They analyzed the audit in relation to the kick supplier Ali Enterprises in Pakistan. This is you might know, a factory that burned down with an unusually high death toll, sadly. And they also analyzed the audit conducted by a German company TÜV in Brumadinho in Brazil, where a dam collapsed, killing over 260 people, and look at the structural problems in this context. And one of the findings that they have, but there's a lot more findings, and maybe it's advisable for you to take a look at, because I think from the criticism against these practices and audits, so the malpractices, we can also draw on what can we improve. And one of the things that can be improved is, for example, to take a close look at who is paying the auditor, and is there a rotation system, or is it one auditor who's always going to the same company over decades and they have very close ties. So these are the main 2 approaches that can be taken, but there's a lot more things that can be done in order to make sure that audits are conducted in a proper way. And now I've lost the last question. I'm really sorry.
It's related to living wage and how to try to bring about change in this regard when the supplier is not open about their price breakdown.
Yeah, I think one of the main problems in this context, but this doesn't only apply to living wages, this applies to many other human rights and environmental problems in supply chains. One of the main problems is that many suppliers accept contractual offers with, for example, German companies who are obliged under the law, although the price that's being offered does not suffice to meet production costs. And this then usually leads to minimum wages not being met, or even living wages not being met, or other things like work and health and safety at work, environmental obligations, and so on. And when companies are looking, for example, at how they can revise their contractual practice, their procurement practices, I mean, in the context of competition in the market, suppliers who are dependent on these offers and who are already willing to accept offers who are not meeting production costs, they're not going to go into the bidding with a higher offer explaining this is something they need to do to meet an adequate living wage, risking that they're not going to get the contract. But what can be done instead by companies is to draft into the contracts that the supplier has the right to renegotiate the price when they show that they need a higher price to meet adequate living wages, to comply with health and safety obligations, to comply with environmental obligations, but they need to prove it then. And then the second clause could be that the supplier also, upon requests by the customer, needs to prove that the money is actually used in this for these purposes. But that's something that might be a workaround around the problem that is created by market realities.
Yeah. All right, then thank you so much, Michaela. Let's move on straight to Erica. We are quite short of time. We have now, I would say, 20 minutes in total. I'll keep my closing very short. So Anina already announced she will only need 5 minutes, or maybe Erica will try to keep it within 10 minutes. But yeah, I will also cut my part short, so you have up to 15 minutes. But if you want to select Q&A, we should try to stick with 10. So please, Erica.
Yeah. I will go rather fast, and I will skip like the 2 first slides. This one you can skip it as well. Maybe go to the next one again. Next. Yeah, here. No, before. Thanks. So I'm going to talk about risk assessment tool. I think there was a question here as well as to what can we do. There was some very interesting resources shared by Michaela. Something that we are developing now is a risk assessment tool. So I want to remind first that at amfori, we do not intend to do risk assessment for companies, but rather support them in assisting them through data and through guidance in their journey. So I think it's something important to mention here, because risk assessment is very personal to each company. So here the intention is to guide really the process. So the risk assessment tool is composed of 3 different steps. So you can see the identification step, prioritization, and management step. The identification stage helps company mapping out country level risks based on external data. The second stage will support company in focusing on what is important and what they can deal with based on their current resources and the level of effort needed. And then the third stage will support the risk management process in answering the question to, and now what do I do? Okay, so what do I do to prevent my risk, mitigate my risk, or remediate my risk that I have previously identified and prioritized? Next. So I will focus here on the first stage, okay, and more precisely the first step of first stage. So we are still in the identification stage. So how am I mapping out my risk, which is now providing country level information on human rights and environmental risks to help company in their decision-making process. And so now I will be presenting just the ESG risk identification index, which will be launched in June this year. The tool centralizes risk data regarding environmental, social, and governance topic. Okay, so you can see for the environment, for example, we will have risk indicators on climate change, air quality, wastewater. For social, working hours, fair remuneration, bonded labor, and for governance, things like human rights treaty, environmental treaty, conflict data, and so on. The topics were scoped based on the amfori normative framework. So if you know it, you know that, of course, we can't cover all the environmental topic or all the social topic, but we had to frame it within our own code of conduct. The data was normalized to provide a level of risk. So low, medium, high, very high. And the risk level give you a gross risk score. So helping you in what Michaela said as your abstract risk. So it's a little bit a help in your desktop research. And as a company, this first layer of data should help in focusing and funneling your research into what are your salient risks. So really your real risk, the concrete risks. In other words, Low, medium, high, and very high were defined based on potential risks and should define the additional due diligence effort a company will put on a specific risk and eventually on a specific business partner. The risk level should only be a starting point to scope a company salient risk and should be complemented by company research, internal data, stakeholder engagement, and so on. Next. Let's have a look. Let's go on the next. Just to give you an idea of how it will look like. So it's a dashboard. It's the amfori Insight dashboard. It's quite basic, but you will see a map, different country filtering, and then a table with the different indicators filtered by categories, so environmental, social, and governance indicators. Each indicator will have an indicator year, so it's pretty much when the data was extracted, and then a risk score. It's still a demo environment, so you don't really see the risk level, but at one point you will be seeing low, medium, high, and very high risks. Next. Next and final slide. No, just going back here. Okay, and so you will also have the possibility to extract this data on a country view or on an indicator view. So this will allow you to have either, let's say, a full database for every country, but you should also be able to, if you have mapped your supply chain on the amfori, a sustainability platform, to have only relevant data based on where you have your supply chain. So I'm going to stop here so we have eventually time for questions. I hope this was clear, but at least it was short.
Thanks so much, Erica. And I have already a question here where there will be a version in Chinese available for this as well.
At the moment, no. At the moment, we have it only in English, and I don't think we have yet the possibility to translate it into other languages. At the moment, not saying that it's not possible, but again, it needs to be seen.
Perfect. All right, let's move on to Anina. And yeah, Anina will be presenting the German PST, so the Sustainable Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, the Textilbündnis, you know, the tools or support they offer in terms of risk analysis. Anina, please.
Thank you very much, Francis. Yeah, I'm Anina Buse. I work for the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, short PST, which, in case you were attending, you got to know already in the last webinar. We are a multi-stakeholder initiative with a focus on the German textile industry, with currently around 127 members from different stakeholder groups. And from 2023 onwards, the activities of the PST focus on 3 basic elements, which you can see on the right-hand side. And if you're interested, about which you can find more info on our website. Of relevance for today's topic is our basic element 1, which involves companies making an individual commitment to implementing due diligence and to transparently reporting on the implementation status. And the reporting is centered on a risk analysis and prioritization of sector risks. So as the risk analysis is the core element of our reporting process, we invested in supportive measures for our members. In 2021, we adapted our whole process to the OECD sector guideline, which foregrounds the risk-based approach. And for instance, the PST provides a guidance on identifying and prioritizing risks to support members during the risk analysis. And we apply the methodology according to the OECD and require members to prioritize with regard to severity of risk and likelihood, where you can see the formula here in which you heard before. Next slide, please. In 2021, we also introduced a tool called the Textile Risk Expert System, short TREX, which helps to analyze and prioritize social, environmental, and corruption risks in the textile supply chain. So the TREX guides the risk analysis in a structured and user-friendly way. It helps determine abstract risks in the supply chain, compile information on the probability of risks occurring, taking into account mitigation measures and previous incidents, identify those specific risks that are particularly relevant in the respective supply chains, and prioritize the most serious risks. And the result is then a deeper understanding of abstract risks, existing mitigation measures and processes, and concrete and company-specific risks. And moving on to the next slide, to give you a better understanding of the tool, in a first step, it works with indices on country risks. So on the right, you can see a heat map with country risks per sector risks. And based on these indices and importantly, the supply chain information the companies provide, it helps to get a first risk profile for the different sector risks based on the company's information on production countries, materials, and processes. And on the next slide, so coming back to what I said in the beginning and the reporting on the implementation of due diligence, companies that are not affected by the German Supply Chain Act yet, or as of next year, will report on their due diligence implementation according to our PST internal process, the so-called review process. The reporting is centered on the risk analysis and prioritization and derived targets and measures, as well as the progress of the companies. And it includes assessment meetings and in the end, the publication of reports. So and throughout the process, the PST provides the infrastructure and support to conduct the risk analysis and define targets where the most severe risk occur. And yeah, that is it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm handing over to Francis.
Thank you so much, Anina. There have also been a couple of questions here to Erica in the chat, coming back to the risk country indicators that she presented earlier. So the first question, Erica, relates to the risk score and if it will impact the factory's risk in their country where the factory is located. So that would be the first question. Oh, I see Erica dropped out somehow. Okay, then I'll try to answer it. So here the country risk score should help companies in focusing their monitoring activities at their business partner level. So yes, it will impact in your decision-making process. And at the moment, the country risk score are at country level, but the database will be extended after the release of the first version in June to also sectors at a later stage and whenever the data is available. And of course, as also shown in the presentation, there will be a possibility to later on incorporate the data of the audits, for example, to give you both that abstract and that concrete assessment of risk or analysis of risk. So it's all together in one place. Then there is a question to both Anina and Erica. If the risk mapping tools are fueled with direct worker feedback data. Maybe Anina first direct to you, and then I will go back to our presentation.
Yeah, sure. Actually, they are not. So they work with public indices, for example, a corruption index of a country. So by now, we are not that far taking into account workers' feedback at the moment.
maybe from our side, I can say that we are also not there, at least not yet. So as mentioned, also with regard to feeding in audit results into the overall risk analysis, as consolidated on the platform insights. We also can think of course, the supply chain grievance mechanism, which is, of course, a way for workers to give direct input on their situation, and which, of course, should inform your risk analysis, both to prevent, certain violations from actually materializing, or if actual violations have occurred. This is not currently reflected in the risk indicator tool that will be launched in June. However, we of course have that data on our platform, so you can cross-reference these different inputs through different tools. But ultimately, we intend to bring all the different data points more and more together. So I think in the midterm, this is something that we will certainly explore. Also thinking of other data points, for example, worker surveys, which is also functionality on the platform that you can use. That's another way of informing your risk analysis more broadly, but at this point it's not included. That's just congratulations. It was a great webinar. Thank you very much. It's a nice feedback here. And I think in terms of questions, we have covered everything. Let me just quickly skim through the chat. I think we did. So at this note, then I would close the Q&A, and I would like to thank all of our speakers very much for their excellent contributions. Also, of course, big thank you generally to the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles for co-hosting this webinar series with us, and of course to Michaela and the German government's Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights for supporting this webinar series through in the various stages. We are also excited that we have another webinar coming up, again co-hosted by the German PST, of course, and with the support of the German Helpdesk, which will focus on grievance mechanisms as a key instrument to enable access to remedy. That's of course a very critical one, since it's a key obligation under the German Supply Chain Act. So this is an important topic, and of course all of you are invited to participate again. Then also like to draw your attention to the fact that we are celebrating 20 years of amfori BSCI this year at our annual event in Berlin on the 6th and 7th of November. So very much hoping to see many of you face to face, which is a nice change from just engaging virtually. And on that note, I'd like to thank our speakers very, very much for these excellent contributions, and of course all our participants for all these great questions. I think there's always good discussions, and would love to do this at some point also in a face-to-face format to really just have more of a dialogue than just the speakers presenting for themselves. But on this note, thank you all very, very much. It was great to have you all here today, and looking forward to seeing most of you on the 22nd of May. Thank you very much.